Manchester City have all the feet in the doors of history as they have beaten Manchester United 2-1 in the FA Cup final today, and they are only a Champions League final away from completing a famous treble. But when you're doing a tactical review of a game like this, you want there to be some interesting tactical goals, and the goals that actually happened were the keeper hit it long, and then Gundogan hit a cracking volley from outside the box. And then at the other end, we had an equaliser from Fernandes from a penalty. And then early in the second half, Kevin De Bruyne took a free kick from around here. It went straight to Gundogan, who hit a cracking volley from outside the box. So it feels as though none of those goals were necessarily impacted by the tactical realities underpinning the game. But I'm here to tell you that's not true. We can find some interesting tactical nuggets in this game, and I'm going to talk to you about them now. So in the preview to this game, we talked all about how Manchester United were going to have to stop Manchester City from building up in their 3-2 shape that we've started seeing in the second half of the season. And I suggested that they could do that by going to a 4-4-2 shape. And actually, Manchester United sort of did that. So what we saw was actually the same sort of formation, so a 4-2-3-1, but actually we saw a very narrow front three. We saw Christian Eriksen in the 10 spot, and the general idea was to make sure that these two pivot players in Rodri and Stones weren't getting a huge amount of time and space on the ball, and that meant that Manchester United were happy to allow Man City space in the wide areas because they had some cheats to help them out if the ball went there. So let's imagine that Manchester City are building up from the back here, and what we'd see from Manchester United is a really passive press, so they're happy to allow the ball to come out to one of these centre-backs. They're going to leave them there. And in this situation, you're making sure that these two pivot players are covered. And so the idea here is that if the ball does come out to one of their outside centre-backs here, the wide player in the front line of the Man United press can move across to make sure that they don't get much time on the ball. And then you have this series of moves in order to stop these two pivots having space. So you'll see Eriksen come across and then Sancho cover the other pivot player. You might even see Rashford coming in across here. So we do still have this weakness on the other side of the pitch, but the idea is that you aren't able to find that weakness easily because you've got everyone else in between them tightly marked. And again, on the other side, what you would see is that if the ball came out to Walker this time, Sancho would be ready to press on him. That means that Eriksen can come across here, Fernandes can come across on Rodri, and again, Rashford could push out to Diaz if he needed to, or the goalkeeper. And there is a level of fluidity here, so if Rashford actually ends up covering one of the pivot players, you might see Eriksen take his place in the press and go into a forward area as well. And then if Manchester City do manage to actually evade this front line of the press and get the wide player in space on the ball, we'll actually see Manchester United form this flattish front four here. So you ended up with 4 players in a row, again making sure that there's no space and time around the pivot players. Now elsewhere on the field, Haaland is obviously the striker, and Manchester United want to keep 2 players on him because he's a dangerous prospect. Then you have the 2 6s here, and their job is to keep the 2 8s of Manchester City quiet, and then the fullbacks match up on the wide players like this. Now you may notice that that does mean that there is a big weakness in the centre of the field here, because as we know, Pep likes his wide players to get high and wide, pin the fullbacks in these sorts of areas, and it generates a huge amount of space in the central midfield area. And because the 2 Manchester United 6s are man-to-man on their players, there is the possibility for Manchester United 8s to move wide, create space, and then Haaland to drop in to generate an overload in this area of the pitch in the middle. Now in these situations, one of the centre-backs would track Haaland, but by moving ahead of the centre-back, what he actually does is he generates a get-out for Manchester City if the Manchester United press is causing them too many problems. Because what you can do is you can feed the ball into this space in the middle to Haaland, and he can just play a bounce pass one way or the other to one of the pivot players, and you've got past that first line of Manchester United pressure. And this is exactly what happened for the first goal. So on the board in front of me here, we can see this is Ortega, the Manchester City goalkeeper. He's just received the ball back from kickoff. This is within the first 14 seconds of the game. And what he's going to do now is he's going to play the ball long into this kind of area. But actually what we can see here is Erling Haaland, who's dropped out of the front line, and he's attracted pressure, actually not from the centre-back, but one of the centre midfielders. So this is Casemiro here moving across to get Erling Haaland when the ball arrives at him. And here's Fred coming across to mark Kevin De Bruyne. But the interesting thing to note is that, as we said before, by leaving these 2 centre midfielders exposed, that means that the other number 8 for Manchester City, Gundogan, is not being marked at all in the centre here, so that when the ball comes back across, he's going to find himself in space. So if we move the tape forward, we can see here is Erling Haaland winning his header against Casemiro. The ball is now going to come to Kevin De Bruyne, who's going to win a header against Fred. And we can see here Gundogan in a huge amount of space. The ball bounces perfectly for him, and he can just play that volley into the top corner. So we can already see the tactical ideas playing out here. By adopting a 4-2-4 shape in the press, Manchester United have left their central midfielders exposed. Erling Haaland can drop in, create an overload, and so although this may look like a really low quality chance, it is actually the direct consequence of tactical decisions made by Erik ten Hag. So it's 14 seconds into the game and Manchester City are 1-0 up, and this changes the way that the game is going to be played out because Manchester City can now try and control the game, and we know that they're going to do that through possession. So they'll be possessing the ball not just to move it into dangerous areas to score, but they'll also be holding onto the ball to make sure that Manchester United don't have it to score a goal themselves. And as we've said before, Manchester City's structure is really good for this kind of thing, and Manchester United are pressing fairly passively as well. They have two options here. They can either stay passive and Manchester City can just play the ball around the back, keep possession of the ball, or they start pushing forward and they leave the centre midfield area exposed. Now, as we know, Manchester United are going to try and generate goals by playing really directly. They're going to do these direct attacking plays, which will see them either generate chances through quick passes through the middle into this forward unit here, who can then attack the opposition back line, or they will do counter pressing, and the idea then is to win the ball back, these sorts of areas, and then spring a really quick counter-attacking movement. But once again, this unit of players becomes really important for Pep Guardiola, and actually the big story of this season is that Pep Guardiola has started loading these 5 positions with players who are really good 1v1 defenders, actually really physical players as well. So we've now got Akanji and Walker in the wide positions who can come up against players like Sancho and Fernandes. Actually, in the second half, Manchester United brought on Garnacho, who's a really good ball carrier and dribbler, and he's immediately coming up against Kyle Walker, who, as we know, is a really good 1v1 defender who has pace as well. Now, Garnacho did have a good game, caused lots of problems for Manchester City, but even if you get around Kyle Walker, you're then faced with this situation where John Stones can drop in alongside Ruben Diaz. You've got Kanji as well, and then Rodri coming in here. And if you add Haaland to the mix as well, it means that Manchester City are now really well positioned to be able to box defend with these players in position. Now, Manchester United did manage to get an equaliser from the penalty spot with Bruno Fernandes putting them level, but early in the second half, Gundogan was able to score another cracking volley from outside the box, and Manchester City were in a positive game state again. And because of all the tools that Manchester City now have, being able to defend both in those transitional moments that Manchester United are generating, but also in these low block box moments, they actually had all they needed to actually keep Manchester United at arm's length. And in the end, that was enough to win them the FA Cup and put them within touching distance of a treble. If I were to tell you that this Manchester City team will be challenging for the treble midway through the season, I don't think any of you would have believed me, because bringing Erling Haaland into this team seemed to make it weaker. But actually the story this season has been how Pep has solved that problem, not by fitting Erling Haaland to the team, but by fitting the team to Erling Haaland, by playing more directly, and doing that by strengthening this defensive base so that the rest of the team can actually play in these more direct attacks that are going to benefit Haaland. And as a result of this, Manchester City head into the Champions League final as the favourites.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.